The conventional reading of post-Enlightenment English colonialism frames it as a panoptical, monolithic power. Under this model, the empire exercises absolute authority, demanding identity and stasis from its subjects. In 1984, theorist Homi Bhabha identified a different mechanism at work. He argued that colonial discourse is inherently fractured. When the epic intention of the civilizing mission attempts to write itself onto the colonized, it repeatedly devolves into irony and farce. Bhabha defined this failure as mimicry. The colonial power desires a reformed, recognizable other, a subject that is, crucially, almost the same, but not quite. This creates a contradictory system. Mimicry acts as a tool of civilizing discipline, enforcing British norms. Yet, by continually producing a slippage, a recognizable but distorted reflection of Englishness, it also becomes an uncontrollable menace to the colonizer. The very mechanism designed to ensure colonial dependence creates the instrument that threatens it. To maintain dominance, the empire must mandate assimilation, but complete assimilation would erase the racial and cultural boundaries that justify the empire's rule. Colonial authority, therefore, is not dismantled solely by external resistance. It is stricken by its own indeterminacy, structurally incapable of enforcing the exact differences it claims are absolute. We can trace this deliberate strategy of incomplete assimilation in British administrative texts. In his 1792 Observations, Charles Grant proposed a system of Christian mission education designed specifically as a form of social control in India. Grant advocated for a reform of manners that would induce the colonial subjects to imitate the English and remain under British protection, but he actively feared that a complete diffusion of liberty would make the Indians politically turbulent. The reform had to be strictly limited. By 1835, Thomas Babington Macaulay took this paradox to its logical extreme in his infamous Minute on Education. Faced with the practical reality of governing millions, the high ideals of European humanism collapsed into an explicitly absurd project. Macaulay sought to engineer a specific buffer class of interpreters. He required a demographic that was, in his words, Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. Bhabha classifies this subject as a partial presence. This partiality is incomplete, lacking full rights, and virtual, a projection of Englishness rather than the reality. Producing these inappropriate objects is a strategic necessity for the colonial state. The mimic man is raised through the English school system specifically to serve as a translator and administrator, while remaining structurally barred from achieving true equality. Mimicry operates differently than earlier post-colonial frameworks. It is not what Aimé Césaire described as total colonization thingification, where the subject is reduced purely to an inert object. It also diverges from Frantz Fanon's model of complete narcissistic identification, where the black man stops being an actional person and only exists to reflect the white man's self-esteem. In Bhabha's reading, the mimic's mask conceals no pure, authentic essence waiting to be liberated from beneath it. The fractured hybridity of the colonial subject is the actual lived reality. The dynamic produces a double vision. The gaze of surveillance deployed by the empire is suddenly returned. The disciplined observer becomes the observed. When the colonizer looks at the mimic man, they expect a reassuring reflection of their natural dominance. Instead, they see an alienated, eccentric version of their own culture looking back at them, breaking the illusion of their absolute priority. This dynamic of visibility and distortion is rooted in the psychoanalytic concept of the scopic drive, which Jacques Lacan mapped through the function of camouflage. Lacan pointed out that the goal of camouflage in human warfare is not to blend harmoniously into the background. It is the act of becoming deliberately modeled against a modeled background, mimicking the environment while remaining a distinct threatening presence. Sigmund Freud analyzed a similar fracture when discussing the partial nature of fantasy, which exists awkwardly between the unconscious and the preconscious. Freud noted that individuals of mixed race might resemble white men, but betray their descent by some striking feature, excluding them from societal privileges. Bhabha maps this striking feature directly onto the colonial subject, a presence that is almost the same but not white. Mimicry becomes highly visible exactly at the site of interdiction. It thrives on the precise boundary between what the colonial power explicitly permits through education and what it violently conceals to maintain control. The political reality of the empire requires a strict, unbreachable boundary of racial difference, but its own civilizing mandate forces it to constantly violate that exact boundary. Linguistically, this crisis disrupts how cultures categorize reality. The standard production of meaning relies on a metaphoric axis, using repression and substitution to sort people into clear, fixed classifications, like rigid racial hierarchies. This chart models how mimicry bypasses metaphor. The vertical axis represents rigid metaphoric bins, but the subject cannot be neatly filed as Englishman or savage. Instead, identity slides along the horizontal metonymic axis, generating fluid, contradictory identity effects that multiply wildly, replacing stable, naturalized identities. The colonizer finds themselves menaced by isolated part objects of assimilation: an anglicized accent, a copied bureaucracy, a tailored suit. These fragments threaten the colonizer's demand for wholeness. The result is an epistemological crisis. Because the mimicking subject is neither entirely other nor entirely the same, the colonial authority loses its ability to enforce a stable definition of reality. This structural ambivalence turns the fetishized culture of the colony into an active, insurgent counter-appeal that testifies directly against its creators. We see the rational, civil discourse of the Enlightenment collapse under this weight in Edward Long's 1774 History of Jamaica. Long attempts to authoritatively classify the colonized labor force, but faced with the terror of resemblance, the realization that the enslaved population is human, his text splinters into prevarication and anxious perversion, culminating in spurious pseudoscientific theories about orangutans. These racist jokes and myths represent the effects of a disavowal, a desperate attempt to replace an uncontrollable reality with a fictional product of desire. This dynamic physically dismembers the primary text of the civilizing mission, the Bible. An 1817 missionary report from Bengal documented that Bibles handed out to locals were instantly stripped of their intended context. They were bartered in markets, thrown away as waste paper, or used to wrap snuff. In this specific context, both the colonized body and the sacred book lose their representational authority. They are displaced, becoming erratic, accidental items in a narrative that refuses to be representative. The monumental history of the empire is fractured, not just by violent rebellion, but by its own flawed mimesis. In demanding a reflection, the colonizer produces a subversive, mocking double that turns